You're listening to the Second Look podcast, where we take a closer look at what we're learning each Sunday at Connection Church to help you grow in your walk with Christ. Here are your hosts, Pastor Joe Terreri and Pastor Dan DeRochers.
Welcome to the Second Look. My name is Dan.
And I'm Joe.
And we're here talking about renew our generosity. But first, hey, Joe.
Good morning, Dan.
Joe, what kind of fruit did you have for breakfast?
You know, I normally have an apple every morning, but we're out. So we were fresh out of apples.
That's
so
shocking.
I had raisin toast and 2 egg bites and a cup of coffee.
Joe,
thanks for asking.
That wasn't my question.
Oh, okay.
My actual question is, nobody really wants to know about something that you've done positively with money.
Sure.
We all want to know, what is the worst financial decision that you've made, or at least ranks in the top 5 of worst financial
That's not hard.
decisions.
I bought a condo in Pottstown. That was by far my worst financial decision ever.
Our apologies to Tara Tavella.
Well, no, Tara got a much better deal than I did. The worst financial decision I ever made is I bought, I had been working on staff here for 20 minutes and we bought a house in Pottstown, but really couldn't afford much. So I ended up buying this condo at Summit Muse, and it was $143,000, which basically probably sounds like a dream to everyone who's looking for a house right now. And by the way, it was a nice place. It was 3 bedrooms. It was like 1,500 square feet. The issue is I bought the house in 2007.
Oh my!
And then the housing market crashed in 2008.
So it was worth $82,000.
Yes.
12
so
months
I
later.
was trapped in this 3-bedroom, and my wife kept getting pregnant, and so I don't know how that happened, but we just kept our family kept growing, and our kids would be like running. We really only had like one room. It was a 3-bedroom, but it was only like one room and like a kitchen nook. And so anyway, my kids would like run up and down the hallway, and then my downstairs neighbor Beverly would bang on her ceiling with a broom. And we had like this 80-20 mortgage, and like the first part of the mortgage was like 6% interest, which is pretty normal now. And then the second part was like
80%.
8%. And I paid like $225 a month, and the principal went down like $15 a month. It was just awful, Dan. That was by far. I don't even like to think about how much money I lost. Thanks for bringing it up, by the way.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah,
This begins. Should we just cancel the podcast and
no,
do
now I'm
counseling?
Angry. Yeah, now I'm angry. So. But the Lord has redeemed that situation, and things are much better
really
now.
funny.
Yes, thanks for asking, Dan.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Have you ever made a bad financial decision? I mean, you are very good with money, so, and Alicia is too. So please,
probably. I don't know.
Make sure it's painful.
I don't. It's not that painful. When we moved to Springfield, Missouri, like 7 or 8 years ago, we were coming from overseas. We didn't have anything. We had to buy cars again.
Yeah.
All of those things. So we were one car for a long time, and then I just needed something to get me back and forth to work. Here's what you need to know about Springfield, Missouri. Springfield, Missouri, fine, but there is nothing 3 hours in every direction from Springfield. So were there perfectly fine used cars in Springfield? Yes. Did I choose one of those? No. I chose to find a car, a 2006 Volkswagen Jetta Wolfsburg edition in Kansas City.
Okay.
So I drove 3 hours to go see it. The engine misfired. It was in otherwise fine condition. I drove 3 hours home.
Yeah.
I subsequently decided, hey, if they fix the car, I'll go buy it. They said, we fixed it. I drove 3 hours there with my family, picked up the car.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, they had not fixed the car. But I paid for it, and it was my problem.
Yes.
And then that car continued to cause me problems for the next several years.
That doesn't sound as bad as buying a house.
No, and it was under $5,000.
All right,
total,
that didn't compare. I didn't need you to tell me some, made up story. All right, that's fine. Let's talk about tithing.
Let's talk about tithing, Joe.
Or generosity.
Either way,
yes.
Or both ways.
Yes.
Joe, one of the things that you said in your opening was that some people have never been taught to give.
Yes.
Some people are scared to give,
mm-hmm.
and other people are giving, but it's not their first and best.
Yep.
And I think maybe there's even another category of people that not necessarily relating to giving, and maybe even falls into some of those categories, but people that just generally don't pay attention to their finances.
Yeah, I think we had both listened to a podcast recently with a financial expert who said that the number one problem that he sees that couples have with their personal finances is that they don't know how much they make.
Yeah.
And so lots of people, when it comes to money, and I'm sure it's no one like listening, but lots of
No,
people,
definitely not.
definitely not. Lots of people, when it comes to money, like their number one problem is they're just not actually paying attention to their personal finance. And one of the ways people actually deal with money is just avoiding the topic altogether. And so it would be weird thinking about, like, I'm guessing there's probably some people yesterday, and I say this without a shred of judgment, just the statistics would bear this out, that there's probably a lot of people or some people listening yesterday who might have been thinking, I don't even know what a tithe of my income would be. Like, what's that number?
Yeah, because a lot of people operate like if there's money in the account and a need comes up, we'll do the thing.
Right.
And then in between paychecks or kind of right at when you're getting to like kind of the fumes of the bank account, it's like, okay, let's push the brakes a little bit until the next paycheck comes. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're living paycheck to paycheck in terms of like just getting by, but sometimes that's how we're operating, with little to no buffer in our accounts and not really understanding the totality of what we're working with.
Well, and I would just say it's really difficult to be a good steward of God's resources if you don't have a plan for how you're spending those resources.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes when people, I think one of the things we're always doing in our life is we're like, the way that we don't face where we're at is we just kind of like we do things so we don't have to face reality. And sometimes we do that with our bodies, sometimes we do that with our relationships, sometimes we do that with our money. And so without a plan to be a generous person, you're not going to be one. And that's not a judgment. It's just like, in the same way, if you don't have a plan to be a healthy person, it's tough to be one. If you don't have a plan to have a good marriage, it's tough to have one. If you don't have a plan to be a good friend to those in your life, it's difficult to be a good friend. And so I just want to make sure that this is I'm not picking on the money thing, but there's an intentionality that needs to take place with our personal finances in order to really live out a generous life with God and others.
So what would you recommend for someone who might be in that category of like, I honestly don't know where I would start. I don't, when I open up my bank software or whatever, I don't really know what I'm looking at. The amount I get paid every month changes.
Well, that can happen if you're a waiter or you're in commission-based sales, or your hours change and you're an hourly job. So I'm very, I spent a lot of years of my life, with a budget that was kind of like that. It was kind of tough to plan. So I have a lot of compassion for that.
You just used the word budget.
Yes.
So, and I don't want to derail the podcast, but that's really, it might be a scary word for some.
Yeah.
It might be a foreign word for some. But if we were talking in the context of figuring out what our tithe might be, starting with a very basic budget might be the place to start, especially when we talk about first fruits, right?
Sure.
This budget could have 3 lines.
Yeah.
What I make, a tithe, and then what I can spend.
Right. And so, I do my budget on Excel. And so mine has several lines on it. And the first part of my budget is our planned giving. And so that includes our tithe, that includes what we give to the Gospel Partnership Initiative and some other...
Boscovs?
The Boscovs Partnership Initiative. It's where I invest in Boscovs. That's not
the
true.
number one financial mistake.
Yeah, that's... Anyway. The Gospel Partnership Initiative, and then some other giving that we do. So I think that's part of the thing that is really helpful to... in your budget, the first thing you're doing, so that we give our tithe before we pay our mortgage, and because we're planned out and budgeted, we know we can pay our mortgage, by the way. And so I think it's good to list your expenses and to list your income, and then to figure out making sure that all works. I would also say, from time to time at Connection Church, we offer Financial Peace University, which is an in-your-face financial what would you call it? Financial program, really helping people get out of debt and living on a budget and on a pathway to financial freedom. And so some of us may be confused right now, like, I thought this was a sermon about tithing, but there's this back-end reality to being a generous person, that your house needs to be in order to walk out generosity.
Yeah.
And so I want to just encourage people who may have been overwhelmed or upset or whatever the feeling may have been yesterday is if you need help with your personal finances and you need like a financial coach or you need someone to meet with you and you're listening to this podcast, in all seriousness, reach out to us.
Yes.
There are people that we have around who would love to meet with you and help you just figure out which end is up in your personal finances. And then the next time we offer financial peace, if you want to wait till then, like a class just started, we would encourage you. I was talking to one member of our worship team yesterday, and he was telling me that he started taking financial peace. He's 24, and just how great it's going for him. And I was just like, Jacob, 24 years old is an awesome time to be thinking about your personal finances. So just encouragement to not bury your head in the sand. And I think the most important thing with our money is live in reality.
That's awesome. And that is really a good first place to start, to know where we're at. Okay. A lot of people have thoughts of being generous, but being generous means different things, right?
I would say a lot of people have an impulse to be generous, but sometimes that generosity doesn't happen because the impulse goes away.
Oh,
so
good.
You need to be aware of, I think we have good intentions to be generous, but not a plan to be generous.
That's good. And as we see in Scripture, what you taught yesterday about the tithe, 10%. This was an Old Testament requirement of Israel, that the people would bring their tithes to the storehouse. And so my question for you, for those that might have an impulse or might have a plan to give, does the tithe have to go to the local church?
Yeah, what an awesome question that is. I actually got
Thanks,
that.
you told me to ask it before
Yeah,
the
I
podcast.
did. Well, okay. Dan, you're not supposed to reveal our podcast secrets. That was behind the scenes at the second look. I come to Dan and say, ask me these questions, which I do almost never, by the way.
But today was one of them.
But today was one of them. Anyway, Dan, a woman in our church asked me yesterday, does my whole tithe have to go to the church? And now, listen, let's just be real honest. As the pastor, I want
vested interest,
vested
right?
interest. I would be like, yeah, that'd be great if it did. We have, but here's why I would say biblically, I would say yes, but I'm not going to make a law out of it.
Okay.
But here's what I want to if I could just make a biblical case for why I believe the tithe should go to the local church, I'll just kind of want to read a couple scriptures, okay? So one thing that is really clear, I did not read this passage yesterday, but one of the things that we saw in the Old Testament is that the tithe was meant to go to support the Levites.
Right.
So another important thing to know, there were 3 different tithes in the Old Testament, okay? So an Israelite actually gave right around 24% of their income because there were 2 tithes a year, and then every 3rd year there was a tithe to go to support the poor. However, let's just stay focused on kind of what we think about tithing. So the tithe was meant to support the Levites. The Levites were the priests in Israel, and they did not get any land. So when the promised land was doled out, 11 of the 12 tribes all got their inheritance, quote unquote, which the tribes got different pieces of land. But the Levites, who were the priests, they did not get anything. And so in Numbers chapter 18, verses 20 through 21, here's what it says about the tithe. And the Lord said to Aaron was kind of the first priest in Israel. He was the brother of Moses. He was from the tribe of Levi. And the Lord said to Aaron, you priests will receive no allotment of land or share of property among the people of Israel. I am your share and your allotment. As for the tribe of Levi, your relatives, I will compensate them for their service in the tabernacle. Instead of an allotment of land, I will give them the tithes from the entire land of Israel. So the tithe went to support the Levites, maybe the quote unquote, the pastors. There's this very interesting passage in 1 Corinthians 9.
So that was Old Testament. Now we're moving into the New Testament.
Yep, now we're moving into the New Testament. There's this very interesting passage in 1 Corinthians 9 where Paul is talking about his rights as an apostle to be compensated for gospel ministry. And Paul is making this argument to the Corinthian church, I have the right to receive payment for being an apostle and a gospel worker. And this is what he says. Now, Paul doesn't end up taking any money for gospel work. He's a tent maker, but he wants the Corinthians church to know he has the right. And then he makes this argument. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 13. Don't you realize that those who work in the temple get their meals from the offerings brought to the temple? And those who serve at the altar get a share of the sacrificial offerings. In the same way, the Lord ordered that those who preach the good news should be supported by those who benefit from it. So here's what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 9. He's reaching back to the Old Testament principle of tithing. Now, he doesn't use the word tithe, but that's kind of the practice he's getting at. And then he's importing it into a New Testament scenario of people who preach getting to live off the gifts of people who hear. So I would say it's a biblical principle to bring your whole tithe to the local church because, and listen, I have a vested interest in saying this, but I'm also a pastor and a teacher, and I'm trying to teach in this moment. The tithe actually goes to support the gospel work in your community. And I think people should know all the tithes that come into Connection Church does not go to pay the staff. About half of our giving goes to personnel, which is a very normal standard practice in church life. The other 50% of all of our giving goes to run the other operations of the church. So this is actually a practice that I think Paul carries over into the New Testament, why I think the whole tithe should go to your local church.
I want to branch off now, and we have a voicemail that we received that asks a similar question but goes a little bit further. Let's roll that beautiful bean footage.
Good morning, Pastors Joe, Dan, and Tim. I almost hate to ask again so soon, but Pastor Joe discussed my favorite topic yesterday, generosity.
I love that.
One question. We are told frequently about the tithe of crops, or for most of us, income. But what about the festival tithe mentioned in Deuteronomy 14, 24 to 26? Is there a way we can observe that today, even if as Christians we are no longer under the law? Also, Pastor Joe, even though the Bills didn't make it to the Super Bowl this year, there's always the Puppy Bowl. Thanks for all that you guys do.
Or is it too soon to talk about puppies?
I don't want to talk about dogs or the Bills ever again on this podcast, but I do really appreciate Sherry's question. And Sherry, thanks for reminding us that you can always ask a question. People like, I love that. And so if you ever have questions after a message, this is a great place to ask that question.
Yep.
So I would just say, as I kind of referenced, there were different tithes, but it's tithes and offerings. So I didn't really talk about offerings yesterday, but of course, we are always free to give more. And that was kind of my point with tithing is the doorway to a generous life, not a destination. Because I think what happens in our hearts is as we begin to trust the Lord with the tithe, we're able to see that he is a God of his word and he's faithful to us. And then the Lord asks us to be generous in a lot of other different places.
Yep.
And by the way, God continues to be generous with us as we're generous with others. And so, yes, there were lots of places in the Old Testament where Israel was asked to give, and there's different feasts, as Sherry referenced, and there's different kinds of tithes. But as New Testament people, we are not under the law, and so we are led by the Spirit. And so what I would really want to encourage everyone to do is we want to be Spirit-led in our giving. Now, that can be a cop-out to say, well, I'm not going to tithe to my local church. I'm going to be a Spirit-led giver. And it's like, oh, so you think you're that good at hearing the Spirit through all of your greed and materialism. So that's why I really think tithing is a place to start giving, because it actually opens up our hearts and minds to the reality that God is faithful to his word. And then when he calls us to be generous to whether it's missions or whether it's individuals in our life or other organizations that we're passionate about, we're able to do that. And this is why when we talk about giving above and beyond the tithe at Connection Church, we always say two simple things: pray about it and obey what God says. Pray and obey. It's that simple. And I think, I know this is corny, and I just want to acknowledge that. What I'm about to say is corny, but I heard this recently, and I thought this was so helpful. When we think about tithing, think of it this way. The tithe keeps the church alive, And then our offerings, they go to support other gospel work outside of the church. And so that tithe does, I think, belong in the local church. But a life with Jesus is a life of open-handedness, and he's going to call us to bless people in certain ways. And we've experienced that where people have blessed us, and then we've also gotten to bless others. And I know that's your story too, Dan. But we always want to be the kind of people who are willing to say yes to the Lord.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, how have you seen God provide as you live a life of generosity?
I mean, just story after story, surprising gifts after surprising gifts. I would say, on the receiving end, it's always exciting, but Jesus actually said it's more blessed to give than it is to receive. So what we've received has been astounding. And I added it up once about all the ways that we've been blessed, like financially, outside of like my income. And it's a pretty staggering number, just seeing what God has done in our lives, and how he's blessed us. But I think the other side of it is it's also fun to do the math for all the ways that God's allowed you to give.
Yeah.
And then just to see like, oh gosh, like the Lord allowed me to give X percentage of my income away last year.
Yep.
I actually think it's good to do the math. And it's also good to challenge yourself. And I think if you are married, I think it's good for you and your spouse to say, what would it be like for our giving to grow, to starts at 10%, and maybe next year we'll shoot for 10.5 or 11. And then the year after that, 11.5 or 12. And listen, things are different financially. Sometimes there's a job loss, or sometimes, there's college, or sometimes there's just, unexpected medical stuff, or, getting an accident and you have to buy a new car. And like, here's what I just want to say, like, the Lord knows that. The Lord knows that. But I would say that's why the tithe comes out first. Because when the tithe comes out first, you're less tempted to spend it on yourself.
Yeah.
And you give to God what belongs to him. So I would just say it is such a blessing, yes, to receive, but Jesus is right again, surprisingly, that it is far more blessed to be a giver and to be generous with others, and just to see God be able to use you to impact other people's lives, both personally and organizationally.
Well, today I will live with an open hand to see what you put in it. This has been another episode of The Second Look. You can catch this sermon and much more at our website, cometoconnect.com.
Yeah, what's your Venmo? Oh, just kidding.
Have a great weekend.